The reading is from James chapter 5, verses 7 to 11. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Rima, for that reading, and for Stephen for your welcome. It's lovely to be with you this morning. And today is Advent Sunday, and it's traditionally the time when the church casts its eyes beyond this life to the last things. And the last things traditionally are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Now, I spoke to my wife, Janet, earlier this week, and she said to me, what are you preaching on Sunday? It's Aldates. And I said, well, Advent, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And she said, oh, no. Everyone's just getting into the Christmas spirit. Everyone's getting excited about it. And you're going to talk about these things? And she's kind of right, isn't she? Because somehow everyone is getting ready for Christmas. You go around the shops in the Westgate Centre, and it's all kind of lights and presents and decorations, and everyone's beginning to get ready, getting the cards written and everything else. And then suddenly we get Advent coming into it, which feels a bit like a bit of a dampener on the mood. And yet I want to suggest it's actually vital for us to think about these things. In fact, even it's more than just vital, it's life-giving. And it's something which teaches us some really valuable lessons and builds some key virtues in our lives. Often our time is spent on the immediate. You know, we're meeting deadlines, we're getting the kids to school, we're ordering the shopping, we're managing our diary. There's the little micro things that occupy so much of our attention. And today is a day when we're reminded of that line in the Creed that says that Christ will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. And it's as if we're invited to sort of step back and take a bit of a wide-angle lens on things, to draw back and see the big picture as we look at the world before we came onto the scene, and as it will be after we've departed the scene long into the future. And recognize that at the end of our lives, at the end of time, there will be this great verdict, this summing up, this last word of all words. And so today I want to offer 4 reasons why the idea of God's judgment is in fact good news and is good for us. Well, the first one. The first one is that judgment builds hope. Our text says this: be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Now, we tend to think, don't we, when we hear that word judgment, divine judgment, we tend to think it's bad news. When you think of divine judgment, you maybe think of someone standing at just by Carfax with a billboard on their front saying, the end is nigh, prepare to meet thy maker, trying to scare people into belief. And we tend to fear the idea of judgment. I remember, about a number of years ago, I was coming towards the end of my PhD, as many of you here in this congregation have done as well. What happens with a PhD is you spend hours and hours and years studying this topic, and then you get to the end and you have to go to what's called a viva, where you have to defend your thesis against, well, not against, but with a number of experts on your field. And I can remember going to this viva, and if you ever sort of have a sense of fearing judgment, it's going to a viva of a PhD, I can tell you that. So I went to this viva. I had spent years and years on this thesis. We discussed it for an hour and a half or whatever. And what happens at the end is they kind of say, well, if you'd like to leave for a moment, we're going to decide what to do. and you step out of the room, and you're aware that your fate is being decided while you wait in the room next door. Now, I said to myself as I walked out of the room, I said, well, if it's gone all right, it's going to be pretty quick. They're just going to look around and say, yeah, it was fine, wasn't it? We really liked it. Yeah, we'll have him back in within 5-10 minutes. 5-10 minutes turned into 15. 15 turned into 20. 20 minutes turned to 25. 25 turned to 30 minutes. By this time, I was in despair. I had convinced myself that what they were basically deciding whether to fail it entirely or whether to get me to entirely rewrite the whole thing and spend the next 3 years of my life on it. This was bad news. The longer it went on, the worse it would get. And anyway, eventually they kind of opened the door, and I kind of went back in again, and they said, well, congratulations, Dr. Tomlin. We're very pleased to say that we're happy to award you the degree. And then we had a little chat and everything else. And so then just as I was about to leave, I sort of said, look, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why did you take so long to get me back in again? And they said, oh, we were just having a cup of tea. So I said, well, thank you very much. Very nice. It is a strange thing, isn't it? We fear judgment. When we're being judged, we always assume the worst. But the strange thing is, in the Bible, most people are actually quite positive about judgment. They look forward to it. Jesus tells a story about a widow who gets into an argument with a neighbor. Maybe it's about who owns a field, and she's got no money, she's got no husband to argue her case, she's got no power at all to get justice. In fact, the judge is just not that interested. And Jesus, as he tells the story, says that this judge neither feared God nor cared what people thought. So the widow kept on coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. She desperately wants judgment. She wants justice. She doesn't fear it. She longs for it. And again in the Psalms, you get this notice of people saying, give judgment for me, O Lord. And God's judgment is good news because it promises the restoration of order. It promises final justice, the putting things right again. And that's why it builds a sense of hope in us. Because judgment is good news for those who are on the receiving end of injustice in this age. If you're being bullied at school, you want justice. If you're working with a terrible boss who cares nothing about you at all, you want justice. If you're living under an oppressive regime, you want justice, you want judgment. You want things to be put right. And the prospect of judgment is good news for those who are impatient with the way that things are here and now. And that describes us Christians, because we are people who surely are impatient with the way things are right here and now. We're not happy with the way things are. We're longing and waiting for the kingdom of God to come, as Jesus promised. And very often we don't feel we've got much power to change the way things are. Judgment tells us that the world as it is right now is the wrong way up, but that one day God will turn it right again. He will turn the world the right way up. And that, as it says in the book of Revelation, there will be that day when there will be no more death, nor mourning, nor crying, nor pain, because the old order of things has passed away. Our experience now is that we live in a life that is full of death and mourning and crying and pain. You can't avoid it. But the promise of the Bible is that one day God will renew this world. He will turn it the right way up again. There will be a new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells. And there will be a place in that new world for those whose faith is in Jesus Christ. So the prospect of judgment builds a sense of hope in us, that it's not always going to be like this. Second thing, the judgment builds compassion. Verse 9 of our passage from the book of James, that we read a few moments ago, said this: don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. And it's a bit of scripture that reminds us that it's very easy to grumble at other people. And my guess is probably most of us, if not all of us, have done it at some point in this past week. Somebody treated you badly at work, maybe behaved badly towards you. Someone in your family maybe lost their temper. Maybe you had an argument with a friend. They said bad things about you, and you said bad things about them. We all do it. We all grumble about other people. And we've become a very judgmental society. We've maybe no longer believed these days in the judgment of God, but we've replaced it with a much more severe judgment, and that is the judgment of social media. I read something written by a Cambridge graduate this last week. He said this: "It is the paradox of my generation. We are supposedly the most tolerant and liberal, the most concerned with getting it right, and yet when one of our comrades slips up and falls out of step, they become the enemy. We cut friends and acquaintances from our lives on the basis of secondhand information about something deemed morally iffy that they may or may not have said or done, but we're all so perpetually afraid that precisely the same thing could happen to us." Cancel culture is a thing. And I wonder sometimes, maybe it's because we think it's down to us to judge. We're so concerned to get rid of bad opinions or harmful ideas that we will do everything to silence them. And so here comes our scripture again. Don't grumble against one another, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Now, the reason why I am not to grumble at my neighbor, my friend, wherever it might be, is because at the end of the day, I am not their judge. God is. And the reason is because God is the only one who's really qualified to judge them. Just imagine for a moment, I don't know, something terrible happened and you found yourself in court. Maybe it was a traffic offense or you're accused of some minor fraud or something like that. And you kind of know you're guilty. You know you're innocent. And you go into it thinking, surely this will exonerate me altogether. And maybe the lawyer for the prosecution gets up and starts recounting the case against you. And about 10 minutes into this recitation, the judge sort of bangs his gavel on the table and says, "Oh, come on, stop this. I'm bored stiff. I don't want to listen to this. Guilty, take him away." You would be outraged. You would say, you can't do that. You have to listen to the whole story. You can't just listen to one side of it. You've got to listen to the other side as well. And then you can make up your mind. The reality is that only God knows the whole story of this person that I am grumbling against. I cannot know the whole story. My knowledge of that person is incomplete. And so, therefore, I really need to give up acting as if I am my brother's judge, because I do not know the whole story. And I am always guilty of prejudice. Now, that word prejudice simply means prejudice. It means judging before the time, judging before you know the whole story. And that's what we do all the time. Whenever we grumble against one another, we grumble because we don't know the whole story, and yet we stand in judgment upon them. And that's the moment when we need to remember this doctrine of divine judgment, that only God knows the whole story. He is their judge, not me. And that's why if you believe in divine judgment, it makes it a little bit easier to live with opinions or actions that you really don't agree with, because you realize there may be something behind that person's actions or opinions that I just don't understand. Sometimes, I get into an argument with someone and I think that person's wrong, they think I'm wrong, and we kind of feel we've got to have a fight to the death. Somebody has to win. And the doctrine of divine judgment tells us that, well, one day God will decide between us. And we can sometimes live with that disagreement in the meantime. It takes the pressure off me to be the judge, and instead to have a little bit more compassion on the people I don't agree with. And in that final day, when God judges between us, the great thing is that there is forgiveness when we sometimes get it wrong. Because, of course, we are justified in our Christian faith by faith in Jesus. We're not justified because we get it right all the time. And that means that I don't have to spend every argument bashing away until I win, breaking relationships because the issue is unresolved. Neither do I have to say that the disagreement doesn't matter. Sometimes it really does matter. And there's a really important issue upon which we disagree. That with that spirit of that God is the judge, he will decide, and let's leave it to him. It means that I can live with that in a way that our cancel culture is often not able to do. So if you and I are tempted to judge someone harshly, to grumble against them, remember that you don't know the whole story. God is their judge, not you and not me. Judgment teaches us to be just a little bit more gentle with each other and to show more compassion. Then, thirdly, judgment builds patience. Again, another verse in our reading from James said this: brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And so what he does is he takes this example of the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, who had this burning fire inside them to speak in the name of the Lord, despite all the unpopularity and the discomfort that that often brought. And maybe you've experienced that from time to time as well. You've tried to share your faith with someone, and it didn't really work out very well. Maybe you argued for a Christian perspective in your workplace, and you didn't win the argument. Now, why is it that the prophets needed patience? I think the reason they needed patience was because the real distress that they experienced was not just the unpopularity that that brought. If you're a prophet, you've got to get used to unpopularity. The problem they had was that the rightness of their case was not always clear. Often in the Old Testament, we get this battle between, you can't tell the true prophet from the false prophet. People who should really have supported them didn't always do so. In other words, the prophets didn't always win the argument. This past week, as we were praying earlier in the service, we've had this vote on assisted dying. And now I'm aware that not all Christians agree on this issue, but certainly many of us, as we heard that news of the vote coming through from the House of Commons, were just deeply, deeply saddened by the result, that it felt like a step in the direction of death and not life. And if, like me, you think it's a really bad move for our society, you can kind of think, well, why do people not get? Why do people not see the grave error we've made? And that's when this reminder of the prophets comes in to play, that tells us we will not always win the argument. The world has never understood Christians. Never has. Christian faith doesn't always make sense from the outside. And whether it's a cause, an issue like assisted dying, or whether it's something else you feel passionately about, or about a friend that you long to find faith and they just don't get it, however often you explain it and pray for them and so on, there is no guarantee in this life that the rightness of our cause, the rightness of our case, will always be recognized. Now, that's not a counsel to do nothing. The prophets kept on speaking in the name of the Lord, and we too do the same. We carry on patiently speaking, working, living, openly being open as we can about our Christian faith, trying to persuade people, trying to share our faith in the confident hope that one day, sooner or later, the truth will be seen for what it is. Even if it's not seen now. That one day, God's victory will be apparent to all. That one day Jesus will return to judge the living and the dead, and he will make all things right. Our passage has this image again, doesn't it? See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. It has this image of a farmer sowing seed in his ground and then waiting through the dark days of winter. Days when there doesn't seem to be any life coming out at all, but he waits slowly until the shoots begin to appear, and finally the harvest comes. Human judgments are not the last word, and so we're invited to have patience, to learn patience with a world that doesn't always believe. Patience that God's love and judgment will one day be made clear. But then, lastly, judgment builds trust. Again, our passage said this: you have heard of Job's perseverance, and you've seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. We've just been thinking about our need for patience with a world that just often doesn't understand the Christian faith and doesn't understand us as Christians. And yet, even more than that, perhaps one of our most profound needs is for patience, not just with an unbelieving world, but actually patience with God. Because that's what Job needs. Well, that's what Job needed. You may know the story of Job, this story in the Old Testament of a man who goes through intense suffering. He loses pretty well everything. He loses his health, his family, his wealth, his friends. And yet in the end, God vindicates him. And it's a picture of patience through suffering and doubt. And let's be honest, there are times when it's hard to see what God is up to in his world. You look at the suffering of people in Gaza, or the people who are waiting for their hostages to come home in Israel. You think of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. You think of what's happening in Syria right now. There are all kinds of personal tragedies and struggles that were represented around this church if we were able to speak of them. There are times when God's mercy and compassion is anything but clear. And sometimes, as it was for Job, all the evidence seems to be in the other direction. And this idea of divine judgment urges us to be patient with God, to trust God, even when we don't know what he's doing. There's a moment in the Gospels where Peter is a little bit confused by what Jesus is doing and what he's up to. And Jesus says this word to him. He says, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. Now, how do we do this? How do we be patient with God? How do we build this sense of trust with God? Well, maybe the clue is in this little word that came in our passage from James. It says, you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how he is compassionate and merciful. In other words, you've seen what God is driving at. You've seen the end and how it all works out. I don't know if you know one of the Narnia stories, one of C.S. Lewis's stories called The Horse and His Boy. It's one of the lesser well-known of the Narnia stories. It's a story of a boy called Shasta, who is born into slavery, who through various means finds a talking horse called Bree, and then goes on a long journey to Narnia, which is this place of freedom and joy which lies ahead of him. And the story of the book is basically the story of this journey. And along the way, he has all kinds of adventures, all kinds of crises, all kinds of uncertainties, all kinds of things go on. So in the early part of the story, he's abandoned as a baby and put into a boat. And he's somehow taken in by a fisherman's family and brought up. There's a moment where he's chased by lions. And as the lions chase him, he kind of ends up running alongside a kind of fellow traveler called Aravis, who becomes a friend of his. There's a moment where he sleeps in a graveyard. He's scared stiff of what's happening, and a large cat comes in to comfort him and chases away the jackals that are surrounding him while he sleeps. Then there's a bit at the end of the story where he's rushing to meet a king to warn him about the enemy's army that is coming. And then in the same way, a lion appears to frighten the horses, and they have to ride faster to reach their journey and pass on the message. All these random events that seem to happen all the way through the story. And then at the end of the story, Aslan, who, as you know, is the lion who is the heart of all the Narnia stories, appears to Shasta. And he speaks to him, and he says this: do you know, I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the tombs. I was the lion who drove the jackals away while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you should reach the king in time. And I was the lion that you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay as a child near death so that it came to shore where a man sat wakeful at night to receive you. And he suddenly realizes that unknown to him, through all these random things that were going on in his life, somehow Aslan was working to protect him and guide him to the end of his journey. We are given an assurance that God is compassionate and merciful, that he is at work for our good, even through the changes and chances and the things that seem so random in our lives. How can we be sure that God is compassionate and merciful? Because of what we're about to celebrate in a few weeks' time. Because of Jesus Christ. Because, of course, Christian faith is not a matter of looking at the world and saying, well, the world is a nice place, there must therefore be a nice God. It's actually saying that, no, the world is very often not a very nice place at all. But in the middle of this unquiet and painful world, we're given this gift of Jesus Christ as the absolute pledge and assurance to us that despite what our experience may say, God is compassionate and merciful. In a few moments' time, you'll be given some bread and wine, a token, a physical pledge of that conviction that God is compassionate and merciful, the gift of Christ given to us. And so take it as a sign that God is compassionate and merciful, that he is to be trusted, that God is working out his purpose for you in all kinds of hidden ways. And being a Christian is sometimes holding on to that as tightly as you possibly can. And so there is, I think, a great sense of relief in the doctrine of divine judgment, that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. And in fact, well, without it, the Christian life is pretty intolerable. Without a healthy sense that God will one day put things right, that he is the judge, not you and me, that one day the truth will win out, and that God can be trusted through the confusions of this life. Without that, the Christian life is full of anxiety and tension and stress and nervous activism. So this Advent doctrine, this Advent teaching, that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead, teaches us hope that everything one day will be well. It teaches us compassion for those people we don't understand and we find difficult. It teaches us patience with a world that doesn't often understand us. And it teaches us trust in a God who is full of love and compassion. Amen.